Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome back to the channel here. Hope you all are doing well. Today, as you can see, we've got something we haven't done in a while, which is like a tier list. Obviously, this is like tiermaker.com. It's something I've done before for different like video games or like series and specific stuff and specific games, but it's been a while. I can't remember exactly the last thing I did. I feel like it was something Rome Total War, just Total War in general related, but regardless, as you can see today, we have something a little different here. Hopefully I'm not completely blocking. I tried to minimize my screen there a little bit. But we have Far Cry, like every game in the Far Cry series, essentially. Actually, we're missing the newest one, but we'll we'll make a placeholder for that. I didn't realize that until just a second. But regardless, we're going to be ranking the kind of Far Cry series S all the way to D, as well as I'm not going to lie and say I've played every spin-off Far Cry game out there. So you can go ahead and just add a row below, add a row below D. Type this in here. Not played. There we go. Let's just get some of these out of the way. A lot of these like early spin-off games, not ones that I really played. I'll keep one just as a placeholder for Far Cry 6 here, but just kind of get some of these out of the way. I have not played. We're gonna save this for like the kind of placeholder for Far Cry 6 for this. So that's just gotta keep that in mind. I'll come back to it eventually, of course. But yeah, so we've got all the mainline games in the series plus a placeholder and some spin-offs that I've actually played here, like Far Cry Primal being an example of one that's not in the 1 through 6, kind of rotation there, as well as Blood Dragon, which we'll get to in a second here. It looks like, spoiler alert, it's a fucking fantastic game. But yeah, so let's go into this. I'll preface this by saying also, obviously, you know, I've played stuff. I've played Far Cry before, like the original one. Not extensively. I didn't finish the game, full disclosure, for Far Cry 1 and 2. I didn't finish the games. I've just played them, kind of passively. Obviously, I didn't play them on release. They weren't really kind of my thing back then. And I've just gotten, way after the fact, kind of, I've dipped my toes into the game, which I'll admit obviously hurts the kind of experience you have when you've experienced so much better when it comes to graphics, when it comes to quality of life and stuff like that, when it comes to video games. It's hard to go back to these classic games that were made so long ago, especially when you didn't grow up with them and give them an objective shake. I'm not going to deny that whatsoever because it's like I think Elder Scrolls 5 Skyrim is one of the best games of all time. I think it's the best in the series. A lot of people think it's Morrowind or Oblivion, which I respect their opinion. But for me, having tried to go back and play Morrowind or Daggerfall or even the what the fuck is the first Elder Scrolls called? It's like God, some dungeon crawler game or whatever. But regardless, they're playable today. I've actually tried to go back and play them. It's just not a good experience. I'm sure if you wind the clock back a couple of decades for that, it's kind of tippity top of the iceberg as far as RPGs or dungeon crawlers go. But it's just not going to be the same experience for me coming back to it. So just keeping that in mind, if I kind of lowly rate one of your OG game picks here. But yeah, let's just get into it with the original Far Cry. I'll try to do these in like chronological order somewhat here. But yeah, starting off with the original Far Cry. And again, when I rank these S through D, it's not only in their own right how good of a game it is also in somewhat, of a sense, how good of a game it is stacked up against the rest of the Far Cry series. Because at the end of the day, this is a series rating. It's not a, 1 through, 6, 5, 4, all that. But at the same time, it's in comparison to how good of a game it is in its own right, as well as within the series. I'm gonna put Far Cry, the original here. Hopefully you guys can see this, but I'm gonna put Far Cry at a C tier. You always have to give some brownie points to the first game in any series. It's kind of just like a pay your respects to what came before you, what kickstarted the franchise. It didn't have the benefit of advanced technologies that something like Far Cry 6 had. It didn't have the benefit of learning their mistakes and what they did well over the years with the different games. The first in a long established game series is always something you have to respect. But at the same time, especially if you are looking for some of these games to play now, this would probably be at the bottom of my list. Apart from some of the maybe spin-off games that are probably worse, but when you talk about mainline and like popular Far Cry games, this would probably be towards the bottom of that list. Similarly, going to Far Cry 2, it's again I had a pretty similar experience playing this. I wasn't really infatuated with this much. It's an old clunky game. I played this in the wrong time. Had we been doing this list, ranking the two Far Cries that were out back in the day, this review and this list might be a little different here, but that's just not the situation we're in. I think Far Cry 2 is kind of in the same category here, but I'd rank it below the original Far Cry just because, again, I think it always gets brownie points for like kickstarting a franchise. But let's do three here. We got 3 and 3 Blood Dragon, both games I've played here. But let's do the main one first. Three, obviously, kind of the darling child of this entire series. If you ask a lot of Far Cry fans who, especially, played a lot of the games like this, what their favorite Far Cry, is, who their favorite villain is, three is one that comes up probably the majority of the time, I'd guess. It is a fantastic game with one of the most iconic and well scripted and well made villains of all time. It's an iconic game. It's something that is still playable today if you wanted to go back and play it. It leaps above something like the original Far Cry as far as quality of the game goes and longevity. Far Cry 3 is pretty legendary. That being said, I guess a little spoiler, kind of peeking into the, further into the list here. It's not my favorite Far Cry. Again, I'm probably in the minority with that, but regardless, I don't think Far Cry 3 is my favorite Far Cry. That being said, these spin-off games, the original two Far Cries, it's better than those. It is a terrific game. It is a terrific Far Cry game. It is, top 3 in Far Cry's, no contest, of course. I'm gonna give it an A though. I'm gonna give it an A though. Hopefully you guys can see that on my screen there. I'm gonna give Far Cry 3 an A. It's probably going to be at the top of the A list. Again, I don't want to saturate too many of these categories, especially with how limited games we have. So I think this is at the top of the A category, is where I'd put Far Cry 3. So now let's go to the spin-off series here in Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon. This, I think this is going to be joining it in the A category. I think we're going to group these together. I'd almost want to put this over Far Cry 3, to be completely honest with you guys. It's tempting me to try to put this over Far Cry 3. Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon is a fantastic little like spin-off kind of like DLC almost game. For those of you who aren't familiar, it's like it's like, kind of cliche 90s action movie sci-fi like action adventure game kind of. It's over the top with the explosions and the guns and the cinematics and everything. It's made in this kind of like super sci-fi, like, lasers and colors everywhere. It's picture a 90s like action sci-fi, like futuristic movie, and you've got the picture, and you can even just look at the cover art for the game and get a pretty good idea of what all is going in there. I love Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon. It was a fantastic ride. It's, of course, maybe wasn't fleshed out as some of the games in the series, but I don't really care about length. I don't really care about the content and everything, as long as it delivers a great product. And that's what Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon is. It's almost like mindless fun. It's just you'd almost have a hard time not liking it, in the sense that it's like Doom. Like, how are you gonna dislike Doom? You're just kind of having fun. You're killing shit. It's kind of over the top gore and cinematics and explosions and shit. It's just like overall good time. Next, let's move on to Far Cry 4 here. The 4 is kind of cut out a little bit there, unfortunately. We'll do Primal after this. I just know it was already here. Far Cry 4 for me is in the B category. Again, I think it's similar to Far Cry 3 in the fact that it has an amazing villain. He is one of the more charismatic and one of the more interesting villains you see in a you know in a game universe, which Far Cry in general has really just more so than a lot of other series, really knocked it out of the fucking park when it comes to making these like amazing and really interesting and intriguing villains. Far Cry 3, Far Cry 4, Far Cry 5, 6, obviously with bringing over Gustavo Fring essentially. You've got Far Cry New Dawn is kind of like it's essentially the villains are well, actually, the old villain from Far Cry 5 was in there too, but it's kind of a new post-apocalypse group there and set of siblings. Far Cry 5, the family is fantastic. Obviously, the head guy is fantastic, but the entire like entourage of his brother and sisters, which some are biological, some are adopted type of thing. But regardless, it's Far Cry just makes outstanding villains. I think 4 is a perfect example of that. 4, another great setting. Again, something else that Far Cry does incredibly well is picking very interesting settings, whether it's in the I think it's the Andes Mountains or somewhere in Nepal, I believe, somewhere in that kind of realm for Far Cry 4. You've got tropical islands. You've got 90s sci-fi kind of fucking cities and military bases. You've got the heartland of the United fucking States. For Far Cry 5, I believe in Montana if I remember correctly. Which how something like that happens in fucking Montana. I mean, you know, don't think too much into it for that. You got Far Cry Primal being one of the most interesting. We'll get to that in a second. One of the most interesting settings I've ever seen in a video game. But it's great. And Far Cry 4, great villain, great setting, interesting setting. A little annoying to kind of navigate because of that, but some great spectacles. I just think when it comes to this, I think the villain falls a little short of Far Cry 3, and I think the overall story and gameplay falls just a tad bit short of 3 and some of the newer games in the series I will get to here. But yeah, let's go to Far Cry Primal here. Far Cry Primal is an interesting one. I've kind of been debating in my head this whole time where I'm going to put this. Either kind of top of the C category or bottom of the B category is kind of where I'm leaning between here. Far Cry Primal, as I mentioned earlier, one of the most interesting settings for a video game I've kind of ever seen. This period of history kind of fascinates me. This kind of like pre-civilization hunter-gatherer human era where you are out in the wild. You don't have any civilization necessarily. You're very at threat of all these different prehistoric animals and other humans. It's a fascinating setting. It's a huge pivot from what the normal series is at large here. Obviously, there's no guns and explosions and over the top action and stuff, which Far Cry is essentially a staple for. It is it's a huge divergent from the normal series, but almost in a fascinating way. And the fact that it's really the only main example of that makes it's excusable to me. But then again, it's not necessarily it didn't hit it out of the park necessarily. Um, when you play it, it is an interesting scene. It's something that catches a lot of people's attentions, but at the same time, almost falls short of what you expect a Far Cry game to be. You quickly learn that this cool combat system and divergence from the normal series is cool as a novelty idea for the first bit of the game, obviously, but you soon find yourself missing kind of the over the top actions and explosions and guns and gunplay that you come to know and love in the Far Cry series. It's kind of missed the mark on the gameplay aspect and the story aspect that these themes have. It didn't have a hard hitting like main cast villain like a lot of 3, 4, 5 have. It's kind of just fell short, but it was a great idea, and I commend them for doing that. I'm gonna put Far Cry Primal right at the. I don't know if I should put it right at the top of the C or the bottom of the B category. You know what? We'll do the top of the C because I'm just trying to pace this out for the rest of this list here. Next, we have Far Cry 5. This is going into the S category for me here, so you guys can see that. Far Cry 5 is my favorite Far Cry, bar none. It is everything I want in a Far Cry game. An amazing cast of like main casted, big villains here with the cult family. It's an interesting story. I think the story was great. The different zones with the different family members, the overall plot and setting of the thing. It's set in the United States. Big, props for that, obviously. Some of the characters, side characters, you can have a fucking pet bear. Need I say more? The gunplay was great, as per usual. It's very over the top, very explosion heavy, very action packed, which I always enjoy in Far Cry games. The story was great again. I think the setting was fantastic, and the overall scene of the place being this like crazy, like kind of isolated rural cult was really interesting to explore. I just, I personally loved everything about this game. It was, it was fantastic. The fact that you can play co-op is always a great addition there to share that with a friend. It's just it's a fantastic game. It has, I think it has multiple endings. I never played it again through the sea, but I've heard that the ending was great. I enjoyed it at least. It just I never had a dull moment when I played this game. I never felt, bored. I never felt like I was drudging along doing random tasks I didn't enjoy doing. It was just a fantastic game. Next, we've got Far Cry New Dawn, which is kind of it's not a mainline game, and that's not 1 through 6, but it's kind of like the spin-off of the immediate, or not the immediate, but the soon after aftermath of the Far Cry 5 ending with the bomb going off in the, kind of cult land of Montana that these guys have carved out from Far Cry 5. It features some of the same cast from the Far Cry 5 series. Obviously, the main villain, I don't know why I'm spacing on his name, but the main villain and the head of the family is in the game, but it's in a much more reduced role. He is not the main kind of villain. If you guys can see it, I know it's kind of small and everything, but those two kind of sisters there are the main cast villains. I think, as far as the main cast villains, they're kind of weak, in my opinion. I don't think they're as good as 3, 4, 5, or 6 for that matter. I think it's better than Far Cry Primal. That's where I'm going to put this at B, at the bottom of the B category, a little above Primal. I think the villains are a little better than Primal. I think the story and seeing the continuation of 5, which in my opinion is a fantastic game and story, is really interesting. Seeing some of those characters, seeing the aftermath of what came of this, catastrophic ending in Far Cry 5. I just think it lacked a little. It seemed like a watered down, almost a DLC version of Far Cry 5, and I'm not going to put it over really a lot of the main games here, like 4, 3, and 5 there, and 3 Blood Dragon, of course. And lastly, again, this is placeholder for Far Cry 6. We're ranking Far Cry 6 with this. Lastly is Far Cry 6. Again, when it comes to, big hitting, casted villains here, it doesn't disappoint. It brings in one of the most iconic actors to both, voice act and kind of like live action act. The main villain here. It's an interesting setting. I don't want to mispronounce the name, but it's Havana. I don't know however you say it. But it's in Cuba. It's an interesting setting. It's got one of the most recognizable and most well-liked villain, actors, of course, not in real life necessarily. Um, Personalities you can have. I was really hyped for this game, leading up to it, but it just fell a little short. I don't think the story and the setting had packed as much of a punch as something like a Far Cry 5 or a Far Cry 3, a 3 Blood Dragon, or even a 4, really. Where I'm going to put this, again, this is Far Cry 6. I'm going to put this in the B category, right above Far Cry New Dawn. I think it offered more than New Dawn because it had a better setting, in my opinion, on its own, not, riding the curtails of 5. I think it had a stronger villain. I think the setting was interesting enough, and the gunplay and everything was good enough that it warranted being over Far Cry New Dawn. Again, this is you could make an argument that Far Cry New Dawn is essentially a DLC of Far Cry 5. Honestly, maybe should be lower on this list, but regardless, I think Far Cry 6 does enough to beat that out. But when you're talking about some of the heavy hitters of this series, like 3, 3 Blood Dragon, 4, and 5, I don't really think it lives up to, in the story sense or the kind of setting sense, that those did. And that's why I put that there, kind of right in the middle of my rankings here. Because I don't think it's the worst to play, especially today, but it's definitely not the best and not what I recommend. So, yeah, hopefully you guys can see all of this. trying to make sure the camera should be up here somewhere. But yeah, S through D and not played here. None of the games rank D in my opinion. Like you can put Far Cry 1 or 2 down there if you want to like kind of rank this in like a more chronological sense, I guess. Or like a ranked like 1 through, whatever. But yeah, that's my rankings for this list. Far Cry. Yeah, those are my opinions on kind of best and worst Far Cries as far as those go. One of the few series Ubisoft has left, in my opinion, that they haven't really put on the ropes here. A lot of their failed game series starting. I think Assassin's Creed's in a bad spot, honestly, and same with Siege to some extent, obviously. But that game might be like death proof, at least for the immediate future. But yeah, I think Far Cry 5 is one of their last little nest eggs that they can kind of rely on here. But yeah, that's my rankings for Far Cry. Love to hear you guys' opinions on where you put all these games and what you thought about my rankings and everything. And I hope you all have a good day. And remember to like and subscribe if you enjoy the video on the channel.